First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the partners, and the Institut of Monde Arabe for this opportunity to share with you some thought about mining in the West and Central Arabia. So today we are going to ask ourselves a question. What is the relationship between roads and mines? The search for mines in Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Shield began in the 30s when geological surveys were carried out with a view to the modern exploitation of mineral deposits. More than 1,000 mines have been identified, but above all, their ancient exploitation has been demonstrated, dating back at least to the Bronze Age and proving a phase of intense activity in the early Islamic period with a peak in the 9th century. Considered as one of the driving forces behind the economic boom of the Hijaz in the early Islam, it is the gold, silver, and copper mines, and to a lesser extent also iron, zinc, and lead that will be of particular interest to us. Already considered at the end of the 19th century by Richard Burton in his book The Gold Mines of Midian, the investigation of the 20th century are distinguished by a real scientific and economic significance, with the research of Twitchell and the USGS reports. Studies on roads and mines developed in parallel in the 70s and 80s without any real comparative research being carried out and with very different perspectives. For the pre-Islamic period, roads were studied for their economic interest through the long-distance caravan networks that were set up in the Bronze Age and really developed in the first millennium BC. But for the Islamic period, despite considerable archaeological investment in the roots of this period, with different studies by Saudi researchers, the interest was refocused on the pilgrimage, a vision influenced by the sources and accounts of Western travelers in a kind of fascination for religious ritual practices. The focus on the roads in terms of the remarkable, the monumental, contrasted sharply with the economic consideration dedicated to the mines. However, both studies come to a common conclusion, namely that roads and mining flourished during the first centuries of Islam. More recently, a number of studies have highlighted the astonishing coincidence between the location of the mines and the main pilgrim routes, a similarity that adds to this synchrony. This presentation, therefore, puts this data into perspective, inviting us to move away from a monumental approach of the routes and take on a more systemic and economic approach. We need to look at the ages of these major roads to see that they are not disconnected from the environment they cross. Our aim is therefore to show the importance of this route in early Islamic mining and the importance of controlling the roads. There are still many questions to be answered, but a review of the gaps in the documentation provides a glimpse of the work that needs to be done to better understand this relationship. For the period under consideration, there are many sources that mention the routes of the Arabian Peninsula. Geographers such as Ibn Khordazbah, Al-Hamdani, or Al-Mukhaddasi indicate the main routes and specify the stations. Mention of mines, on the other hand, is rarer. The two geographers who provide the most information are Al-Harbi in his Kitab al-Manasik and Al-Hamdani in his Kitab al-Jawaratain, as well as in his Sifat. However, the sources are silent on any relationship between the mine and these routes. The geographers of the first centuries of Islam mention the pilgrimage routes with varying degrees of precision. But this is an administrative or travel geography that lists the pilgrim station, specifies distances, water resources, and the state of the road infrastructure. In the end, it is above all the condition of the journey that matter to the reader like practical travel guides. Mining exploitation do not seem to have found a place in these books, as if the presence of mines on this route was nothing special and did not merit any attention. They do, however, appear in the background through the names of certain stops, where we find the term Ma'adin, which refers to mining exploitation. This is particularly true of the famous station of Ma'adin al-Nukhra, Ma'adin al-Qurayshi, and Ma'adin Bani Sulaym. These long-distance routes include other mines that are mentioned only briefly, constituting only secondary stops without dwelling on details as to the infrastructure and economy associated with their exploitation. However, by cross-checking the sources, we can see that several mines were also stops along these major routes. This is the case of Asham, mentioned by Al-Hamdani, as a stop on the coastal route from Yemen and indicated by the same author as well as by Al-Yaqubi as one of the main gold mines of the peninsula. Duncan is also located on the same route and is indicated as a gold mine by Al-Hamdani. The same applies to Bisha, located on the inland road of Yemen, which is also a gold mine, but in a state of abandonment at the time of Al-Hamdani. We have the station of Banat Harb, for which Al-Hamdani mentioned the presence of gold and identified during survey with a locality now called Khariyat al-Madin. To finish with Yemen, we have the stop of Ujaira, mentioned by Al-Harbi on the road between Adramaut to Mecca, and indicated as the most important gold mine in the Najd by Al-Hamdani. Other unidentified mines are mentioned on the road between Yemen and the Gulf, Aqiq al-Jarm and Al-Ma'adin. There is also Al-Awsaja on the road to Basra, which according to Al-Hamdani is a silver mine. And for the Egyptian and Syrian routes, it is surprising how few mines are mentioned by the sources, whereas survey has revealed a particularly large concentration of geological sites. Al-Baradouiri indicates the presence of mines at Wadi al-Khura, which was confirmed by geological surveys. And the same applies to the site of Ainuna, for which Al-Hamdani mentions the presence of metals, and Al-Yahubi indicates the search for gold by the local populations. For Darb Zubaydah, Al-Mawan is mentioned by Al-Harbi as a mine. The only mention that implies a relationship between mining and routes is in Al-Hamdani's Kitab al-Jawaratain. There he explicitly indicates the transport of ore on long-distance routes. He mentioned the use of the Al-Khadrad-Basra route used to transport resources from Basra to the mine and ore from the mine to the heart of the caliphate. This was almost certainly the route of Sana up toward Al-Yamama and into Iraq, just as it was for the mines of Aqiq al-Jarm and Al-Ma'adin. Although intensively surveyed in the 70s, the information we have on the mining sites remains meager. The corpus is rich, but the accuracy of the data means that the study of these sites needs to be supplemented by a more systematic approach, enabling better inter-site comparisons. Geological surveys had begun to record old mining operations, and archaeologists then studied some of these sites, recording the remains and mining methods. According to this pioneering research, the early Islamic period in Arabia experienced a boom in mining, with a peak in the 8th and 9th centuries before a gradual decline in the 10th century. The researchers studied the sites without trying to understand their interactions, without looking at the wider context, remaining on an intrasite scale. In this way, they answered one question and avoided another. Their main interest was to understand how the metal was mined. The chaîne opératoire and the material remains of the mines are therefore relatively well known, with extraction sites, furnaces, tools, etc. However, there are still very few dates, and the slag has not been studied in order to document the nature of the ore, the metals, and the treatment processes. What was lacking, however, was a perspective on how the mines were organized. The subject of itineraries, therefore, invites us to return to this line of thought. Studies seem to show a certain hierarchy between the mines. Some are large and were intensively mined by digging shafts and galleries before becoming true open-pit mines. They contain slag, evidence of ore reduction activity in the case of metals that need to be separated from the gangue. Others are much smaller, ranging from simple mining to mineral survey. In addition to this information on the extent and intensity of mining operations, other evidence also point to a hierarchy of sites and above all to a network of sites. The presence of large quantity of slag on certain sites, proportioned to the quantity of ore extracted, suggests that ore was brought in from other extraction sites. Similarly, the low gold content of certain sites in more favorable environments suggests that richer ore was brought in. These initial findings suggest the existence of a main mining site associated with several secondary mines. Some of these mines were large centers where the quantity of ore extracted was significant and where ore reduction and working activities were concentrated. A typology was in fact developed by Abdallah al-Zahrani as part of his study of the mines in the Al-Baha region. On the basis of these clues, we can assume the existence of a genuine network organization of the mines. Then comes the question of the relationship between these networks of mines and the well-known major routes, as well as the relationship of the mines to the stops. If we look at the case as an example such as Samira, we can see that it is located close to numerous mining sites recorded as part of the geological survey. This is the first stop on the Darb Zubaydah that is located close to the mining sites, fitting geologically into the eastern margin of the Arabian Shield in the Suribarat al-Safra gold belt. This refers immediately to the rare mention of a mine found in Al-Harbi, which occurs in the section devoted to the station of Samira. The mountain referred to here could correspond to the massif seen directly to the south of the station, which runs parallel to the line of the road. To the south of the Samira station, a number of mines have been located showing evidence of ancient mining. Most are less than 3 days away. If we go back to the cartographic work based on the geological survey data, we can see that we have no knowledge of the secondary network between the mines and the pilgrim stations. So how was this network structured? The results of the survey suggest a certain hierarchy between the sites, with Al-Najadi holding a special place in the mining complex and must have been the main mine. Due to its position in a large wadi, the Shahib Abu Amayr, Al-Najadi lent itself perfectly to ore working. The presence of several modern dams in the area testified to the potential that this river system offered for supplying water to the sites. As we have noticed, the direct relationship between the mining sites and the main routes has not been documented. To establish this relationship, archaeology most often relies on evidence of metal transformation and, in recent years, on trace elements. This enables us to determine where the metal was transported and processed. While large mining centers existed in Arabia, archaeological data does not allow us to attest to the production of objects on site, with the exception of few sites like Jurash and Al-Rabada, where evidence of metallurgical activity has been discovered. This brings us back to the field of handicrafts, with the transformation of gold, silver, and copper into objects, or the mining of coins. To date, the numismatic studies have failed to identify any major minting center in Arabia for the period in question. There were a few in Yemen, but on a very local scale linked to the development of autonomous dynasties in the region, and a few other local centers are known from numismatic, but this information needs to be reassessed. The old idea of a minting center in Hijaz now seems largely rejected, the term ma'adin, which appears on coins, indicating the provenance of the metal rather than its place of minting. This suggests that most of the gold and silver was exported to minting centers outside the peninsula. We might then assume that the metal was transported in the form of ingots to the places where it was processed. Studies into the origin of the metals, particularly through isotope and trace element studies, should therefore be developed. Underlying the importance of these major routes in a potential metal exchange network, the distribution analyses show that most of these mines are within 2 days' travel of the road. All these data raise questions about the relationship between roads and mines. Are these locations purely coincidental, or do they underline much more complex organizational logics? Before embarking on our explanation, we need to look briefly at the many biases in our knowledge of this object of studies which will have an impact on our thinking. First, the dating problem. How old are the routes and the mines? Operations that are difficult also to identify, the difficulty in identifying extraction sites where there was no reduction. We also have an heterogeneous and incomplete corpus, superficial data with numerous gaps, and also methodological bias. Applying a current economic concept will be anachronistic. So how to explain this relation? First of all, it could be a coincidence linked above all to an environmental determinism. The geographical context remains the most obvious argument for the moment, before we came to various hypotheses about the management of mines and metals. The main north-south routes cross the Arabian Shield along their entire length, while the Darb Zubaydah and Darb al-Basri routes cross it in their western section. It seems natural that these routes should come close to the mines as they travel through this geological region, which has numerous deposits of various ores, including the precious metals, gold and silver, and to a lesser extent, lead, zinc, copper, and iron. The Arabian Shield, or crystalline basement, is crisscrossed by major northwest-southeast trending faults, including quartzite veins and other deposits linked to major metamorphism and geological contacts. For the Egyptian route, it is mainly the Al-Waj belt. For the Darb Zubaydah, it is the Suraybarat al-Safra belt. For that of Yemen, it is the Wadi Bida and Wadi Shwas. Looking at this map, the proximity of the mines to the route appears to be a happy coincidence. Another observation made by Jen Eck and Audrey Pelly is that the stops and the mines respond to the same environmental needs, namely the availability of water, which is essential for ore processing. Thus, the stations, like the mines, without presuming a chronological order of appearance, would have been established in places where the water resource is important and, or potentially, the tree cover of an acacia is more important. This would explain the geographical proximity. In this sense, it is not impossible that certain stations constituted places where ore was worked, but archaeological data is lacking. Anthropological studies of the charcoal should be developed to find out what species were used for ore processing. We might also wonder about the nature of the fuel used for ore processing. It is not impossible that dromedary or equine excrement could have been used to eat the ore, which could reach temperature of around 1000 Celsius degree. So over and above this environmental determinism, which is as much a factor in mining site and stopped installation in one of the most arid environments, the road plays an eminent structuring role in settlements. This raises questions about the economic, social, and sometimes political reasons for the relationship between roads and mines. The first thing that comes to mind is the impact of the development of certain roads. Indeed, although ancient routes were already widely used, the institution of pilgrimage, the relocation of centers of power, and investment in road infrastructure in the early days of Islam must have contributed to an increase in traffic. The parallel could be could then be drawn with the corridor theory developed by the geographer Charles Weill in the case of the railways in the United States. Ultimately, the roads would have enabled the development of pioneer fronts and thus the attachment or settlement of even more numerous mining communities near these major routes. This raises the question of the organization of this population, which were specialized in mining working. This can be seen in the case of the Banu Hanifa, who left for the mine of Al-Alaqi in Egypt in the 10th century in a context of both regional insecurity and a form of gold rush. Were this population nomadic and opportunistic, seeking to settle in the most promising regions? Roads also appear to be essential for mining in the sense that they promote and facilitate its activities. We do not possess this data, but when Al-Hamdani tells us of provisions and equipment coming from Basra, what is the nature of these imports? Another hypothesis on the subject of external import is that put forward by Jack Hirsch. Hirsch put forward the idea that the roads and their facilities were built in response to the need to transport slaves from the coast of the Red Sea to Iraq. Following this line of reasoning, it could be argued that some of the slave labor was used to work in the mines. According to some researchers, this could justify the exploitation of ore that was not very rich in metal in a context where the cost of exploitation was low. Conversely, the roads were mainly used to transport the metal mined, almost certainly in the form of ingots, to minting centers outside the peninsula like Syria and Iraq, region deprived of mining resources, or to other metal workshops. But once again, the evidence is lacking. The wealth of metals mined also meant that these routes had to be controlled. This can be seen on the major routes marked by the presence of defensive structures at the stopping places. We can therefore assume that this proximity also enables garrisons, or at least this defensive structure, to ensure the safety of the metal mined nearby and guarantee that it was transported in good conditions. This raises the question of the nature of the relationship between the caliphal power that controlled the route and the local tribes. Finally, who had authority over the pilgrim stations and mines? The sources tell us about the presence of certain tribes at the stops, such as the Banu Asad, the Tai. Did these tribes exploit the area beforehand, or did they arrive as a matter of opportunism? Who were these miners, really? We know in particular the Banu Sulaim for the eponymous mine, the Banu Ashraf at Radrad, and the Banu Faran. We find in Al-Harbi a co-occurrence of the term Ma'adin and Arab near or in mountain areas. We might then wonder about a possible relationship between this Arab and mining. As this population were nomadic or semi-nomadic, was mining a seasonal activity corresponding to the rainy season. This relationship should be understood in order to draw up an accurate map of the tribal territories, based in particular on the Kitab al-Manasik and the Sifat of Al-Hamdani, and thus clarify the link between mines and pilgrim stations. A map showing, finally, the territorial hold of the Arabian tribes along the routes and close to the mines will be necessary. However, this relationship is of great importance since in a period of instability, tribes are mentioned as committing acts against travelers right up to the Karmat apex at the beginning of the 10th century. So could the end of exploitation be partly linked to the deterioration of this relation between the tribes and central authority? Another hypothesis, which does not rule out the first, is that the mining was abandoned due to the exhaustion of resources. The surface veins were exploited in a few decades or even centuries, and the economic and technological context no longer allows the exploitation of veins at greater depth. Thank you for your attention.